Hello, everyone. I am Linda Woods. I'm going to be your facilitator for this module. So, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction on the Hebrew Bible, especially as it pertains to the study of the Hebrew Bible as literature. And as your Norton anthology points out, this can be a little bit controversial. Um, because most of us are used to approaching the Bible as a work of faith rather than as a work of literature. We're not necessarily trying to separate that, um, but what we will be doing is looking at the Bible from a little bit more of a critical thinking perspective, um, how it works as literature, and how the Christian God and the Hebrew God sort of measures up within the pantheon of all of the other gods of all of the other myths of the world. Now, when we use that word myth, first of all, something I always stress to my students in this course is that mythology in and of itself is not a lie, okay? It's not something made up. We're talking about stories that come from basic essential truths about a culture or civilization. And I always say through those stories, we learn what a culture values, what they revere, what they fear in some cases, what they aspire to be, what is the ideal version of themselves. But far and above all of that, we learn what a culture believes and what they value. And when you think of mythology in those terms, I think you will agree that, the Hebrew Bible definitely qualifies as mythology because these are stories that form the very foundation and fabric of our culture as we know it. So we're going to be looking, of course, at the Bible as history, but here are three key components that I want you to make sure that you take away from this module, which is we actually get the rise of three major world religions from the Hebrew Bible. And among those religions, of course, we get Judaism, we get Islam, and of course, we get Christianity. Although Christianity does not really come into play until we get to the New Testament, right, and the birth of Jesus Christ. So most of what we would call the Old Testament actually falls under the umbrella of Judaism. And of course, the Bible also recounts the rise of Israel as a nation. So it's a very fascinating work for the history that it presents as well as the literature. And then, of course, like I said, we're going to be looking at how the God Jehovah measures up against gods from other cultures that we've studied in this course, such as Zeus. One thing that we learn from looking at that introduction in the Norton Anthology is that the Hebrew God is portrayed in very human terms. He experiences a lot of the same emotions that we do. We see that he gets angry in the Bible. Um, he's at times jealous. He sometimes seems to play favorites with his subjects, with for no apparent reason that we can ascertain. Um, he he has all of our human quirks and foibles, which really begs that question of are we made in God's image or did we create the gods in our image? That's a big chicken or the egg sort of question that I think we can raise that with just about all the gods of all the various mythologies from the works that we've talked about in this course. All right, so I'm just trying to get my slide to update here. If you've never really thought about the Old Testament in these terms, one thing you will learn throughout the course of these stories is that, the Old Testament God kind of gets a bad rap. And there's a few reasons for this because he is portrayed in a lot of these stories as being, not only just and good and powerful and all knowing, but also he's known to engage in a lot of very petty emotions. He First of all, he's very angry most of the time. He's portrayed usually in a very wrathful sort of way. In many of the stories, he's jealous, he's irrational, plays and pits favorites, and this seems almost barbaric from our perspective because most of us have been brought up under the New Testament, right, which teaches the concept of grace. But in the Old Testament, this God was very much demanding of ritual and blood sacrifice in order to appease him. Now, that is very similar to gods of other cultures. Um, but sometimes I think it takes us a little aback to realize that the Hebrew God was just as demanding of blood and sacrifice. Um, in some of the stories, even demanding that parents sacrifice their children in some cases. Now we'll get to that in just a moment because that will bring us to the story of Abraham and Isaac, but also I think more importantly it brings us to the story of the ultimate sacrifice, right? Which is that God so loved us that he sent his only begotten son to make that sacrifice on our behalf so that he would no longer have to have that appeasement. But because of this reputation, I think the Old Testament God sometimes is often misunderstood, um, and it is a big reason why a lot of people through the years, especially a lot of liberal thinking people, people such as the hippies in the 60s, for example, this was why they kind of rebelled against religion and against the Old Testament in particular, as Joni Mitchell said here. In her opinion, the God of the Old Testament is the depiction of evil. Now, again, I'm putting that quote on there for the context. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I'm definitely not saying you need to agree with that. I'm just saying it's something to think about. But here's what changed, and I touched on this briefly already, which is once God made that decision to send Jesus to earth to take on that that blood sacrifice, right? From that, we get the concept of grace, which means, according to the teachings of the New Testament, um, all we have to do to be saved is to come to Jesus Christ because he's already shed his blood for us. And so, because we now have that concept of grace, God doesn't have to spend as much time micromanaging us as he did in the Old Testament. So, I think maybe a good analogy there to think about that is it's like God is like the big head of this, he's the big CEO, right? The head of this corporation. And in olden times, he bore all of the stress of that responsibility. now he can sit back and relax a little bit because he's not having to do as much work, right? His son did a lot of that work for him. So, anyway, um, that is the difference, okay, when we think about Old Testament to New Testament. So I'm actually going to skip this because I want to touch on this question here. And of course, this is straight from the first book of Genesis. And God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. I want you to think about this question. What should this tell us then about either humans or God? And how does this parallel other mythological relationships between humans and the gods? And again, just like I said before, it begs that question of, are we like God, or is it that God is like us? In all of the other myths, at least let's say with the epic hero stories, we start with this concept of a hero who is partially divine by his birthright because one or the other of his parents was a god or goddess. And so he has been imbued with at least half those qualities, right? So it's kind of understood that part of him is half divine. This is where he gets his best qualities, but part of him is also human, and this is where he gets some of his more questionable qualities, right? Because human beings are flawed. We're not perfect, whereas gods are supposed to be perfect. If we take this literally, and this is what the transcendentalists taught, right, in the 19th century, um, it means that we as human beings do have some of those divine qualities of our Creator. Um, but it also means our Creator, just like us, may have some of those very, very human flaws. Again, think about as you go through these stories how that impacts the outcome. Here's another critical thinking question that I like to put forth in my classes, which is, in the Adam and Eve story, did the serpent really lie to Eve, or was there an element of truth there? The knee jerk answer to that, I think, for a lot of you will be that, of course, the devil, which when we say the serpent, I probably should say the devil there because the serpent was just the vessel, right? It was the devil taking the form of the serpent. But with that said, I think a lot of times, like I said, the knee jerk response to that is, well, of course, that was a lie. But now, what Satan told Adam and Eve was that they they would have the knowledge of good and evil once they ate of the fruit of the tree. They do have that in the outcome of that story. They're aware now of the concept of sin. So once they have that awareness, that's what starts to change everything. So they're no longer in this blissful state of ignorance that God intended for them to live in, but he also intended for them to be happy in that ignorance, rather than to be miserable with the knowledge, right, that they would get as a result of that. All right. I am going to close this video out because